The motion for this round reads, "This House regrets the rise of call-out culture." Debating this round are Team Canada, who are proposing, as well as Team USA, who are opposing. Please welcome all the speakers. The adjudicators for this round are Christopher Cohen from South Africa, Matija Pušnik from Slovenia, and Irene McGrath from Scotland. Please welcome. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The end of the speech will be marked by a double mark. The first and the 7th minute are protected from sensitive information and will be marked by 1 mark. The first or the second speaker of each side will deliver a 4-minute reply speech for their side. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. I now invite the first speaker for side proposition.
When an individual is racist, when an individual is sexist, when an individual is homophobic, it's quite clear on both sides of the house that this kind of person needs to change. But what we recognize on side proposition is that the way you get someone to truly change their ways, the way you get an individual to look more positively on women, to look more positively on individuals who may be LGBTQ, is to truly convince them and persuade them and allow them to understand where you are coming from. Because we believe call-out culture in the status quo is unable to do this effectively, so proud to propose. Let's get into some models and some definitions before we get into our 2 contentions. So by this house, we're talking about social movements. So for example, the feminist movement in North America, the caste equality movement in Bangladesh. By regrets, we would tell you that it means that we would prefer a world in which call-out culture never came about. Recognize that this is a retrospective debate about the things call-out culture has done in the past, not the things it might do in the future. What do we support as the alternative? What do we think is likely to come about in a world without call-out culture? No, thank you. We would tell you we support call-in culture, where an individual is privately told about their problematic behavior or how they may change. So this could look like messaging an individual over Facebook, no thank you, if it were like a family member or a friend, or if it were someone who is more large scale like a celebrity, that would be like sending them emails or trying to talk to them in real life. We would tell you we also support discussing social issues in public without targeting individual people. So for example, we would tell you that we prefer a world in which the caste system in India is discussed instead of one particular, no thank you, celebrity being called out. Let's get into this first idea about how we get less support for social movements, why that's necessarily so negative. First, what is the nature of call-out culture? No thank you. We would tell you it applies to many different kinds of people, right? Call-out culture can be smaller scale to an everyday person, so a family member or a friend, but it also can be larger scale towards celebrities. We would tell you the nature of call-out culture is to change the mindsets of people, to call out someone who may have a view that really opposes yours, and to try to convince them to think otherwise. I'll take one of you guys in a second. Why do we think that this is necessarily so negative? I want to talk about the first actor, and these are like bigger name actors, like celebrities, right? What do we think happens when celebrities, for example, are called out? We would tell you individuals get alienated from important social movements, but you would disagree.
Do you regret Philando Castile's girlfriend uploading the video of her boyfriend's death by calling out police brutality?
I'm actually not entirely certain of that example, but we would tell you that ultimately, we think that call-out culture can be effective if it is, a situation in which the person who's being called out can truly understand and have the nuances of like an individual who's calling them out and their perspective. The problem with that, and the problem with most call-out situations, is we think that the individual who's being called out is very unlikely to change, no thank you, but furthermore, the nuances aren't recognized, no thanks. All right, continuing on. How do we see that people are alienated from important social movements? We would give you the example of Katy Perry and when she wore a kimono on stage with the hopes and with the purpose, of celebrating Japanese culture. No, thank you. But of course, many Japanese people and many people in general were extremely upset and believed it was cultural appropriation. And thus there was a huge amount of calling out and backlash towards Katy Perry. What do we think were the results of that, and why do we think it's necessarily so negative? We would tell you what call-out culture creates is a culture in which people who want to support positive social movements are seen as these radical, crazy, hyper-aggressive social justice warriors. We would tell you this is actually negative because it's harder for individuals and supporters, for example, to actually fully buy into this movement. But furthermore, we would tell you that for a lot of Katy Perry's fans, a lot of them, did not turn towards the social, they didn't turn towards the movement because they didn't, fully actually believe that this movement had good intentions. They believed it was hyper-aggressive. But furthermore, right, recognize that we would tell you the nature of call-out culture, the rise we currently see, what it has created is a world in which people naturally turn to call-out culture as one of the first mechanisms and means to contact a celebrity or someone that they believe is doing something that is controversial. Why we think that this is so negative is because with the rise of call-out culture, it is being taken less seriously, right? As more individuals, use call-out culture as their mechanism to truly address celebrities, that's when, ladies and gentlemen, we would tell you this mechanism has never been effective, but continues to lose, any effectiveness it may have currently have. We would tell you why you should actually value this point and why this is so negative is because if the intent of call-out culture is to change the perspective of individuals, to have them positively see social movements, you don't get that opposition side of the house with call-out culture. No, thank you. Why does it matter that people truly have mindsets that change? Why is it not enough to just have this surface level calling out? We would tell you for individuals to truly change what they believe, no thank you, on a lot of these issues, we would tell you people genuinely have to believe it. They have to actually have emotional solidarity and believe that what these movements stand for, no thank you, align with their beliefs. We would tell you that is far less likely to happen in a world when you have call-out culture, and you are far less likely to have things like tangible support. So what this looks like is you're less likely to have people who are attending rallies, no thank you, in support of things like progressive movements, or less likely to attend protests because they don't believe that these align with their beliefs. But furthermore, right, why do we think you actually get the alienation of an individual in a way that is negative? What happens psychologically when an individual is called out? We would tell you for a lot of individuals, they feel personally attacked. They feel extremely humiliated, no thank you, and as if they are unable to defend themselves without actually appearing defensive, because anything they may say in return, no thank you, seems like an attack on their inherent values and beliefs. Why is this? We would tell you that on our side of the house, we agree. It's important for these kinds of people to change their ways, but it's more likely they're going to continue to perpetuate things like bad behaviors if they feel like they actually can't win. We would tell you furthermore, though, we see a problem with call-out culture in that it often doesn't focus on the nuances of a movement. So say, for example, Justin Bieber, when he actually had cornrows, that was seen as extremely problematic, and he was called out for it, no thank you. But that by no means actually reflects what a lot of racial equality movements stand for. But for individuals who, access information through social media, access information through just seeing and hearing what is in the void, no thank you, call-out culture creates a scenario in which a lot of these movements are skewed in ways that are negative. But furthermore, we would tell you another issue with call-out culture is that oftentimes a problem is directly linked to one person. So that direct person who was called out, and it's not actually linked as an institutionalized greater problem that it may be. We would tell you, the impact of this and why you should care is because people are less introspective about themselves and whether they may be contributing to a problem. Instead, individuals just believe, this is something that is because that one person was called out, that one person is, the catalyst for that problem or a really big contributor to that problem without being able to accurately think of themselves. What do we think is the better alternative, and why do we necessarily get that on-side proposition? We would tell you what you would get otherwise is a call-in culture. A culture where individuals are contacted more privately, and it doesn't go through this court of public opinion where everyone gets to add their input and really add their voice to the void. We would tell you this comes in the form of private things like emails and conversations. Why do we think call-ins are necessarily good? We would tell you it's the only way for individuals to feel like they are being properly respected and they are treated with dignity. We think that these individuals, and a lot of individuals who are being called out, are certainly doing things that are problematic, but they are unlikely to change when they feel like as though there is no sympathy and as if there is no understanding. We would tell you call-ins are likely the reality in a world without call-outs, for the reason that now, when you actually, for example, say you had a world with less call-outs, it would be more intuitive to directly contact someone, directly, if you actually wanted to speak with them and change their mind. Whereas a call-out culture is one in which it feels as though that is the only thing you really can do because everyone is shouting into the void. So proud to propose.
The time is 8 minutes and 15 seconds. the first speaker of the opposition for their speech and would like to invite the first speaker of the opposition.
When a politician like Mike Pence thinks that LGBTQ people are disgusting, or when Philando Castile is murdered by a member of the police force, or when Roseanne Barr compares an African-American woman to an ape, or even when Katy Perry wears a kimono because apparently Side Proposition thinks this debate is only about minor instances of cultural appropriation, all of those things have a public impact. The beliefs of politicians impact the public. The rhetoric of powerful individuals impact the public. When Donald Trump spews hateful, vitriolic rhetoric about Muslim women, and that leads to those women having their hijabs ripped off in the street, that all has a public impact. That is why that we think that the public should have a role in holding these individuals accountable, and they have to be held accountable in the public sphere. It is insufficient to just do so privately, one-on-one, in a call-in culture. We think that publicly naming and shaming individuals in the public sphere is principally necessary. That is why we are so proud to oppose today's motion. Before I introduce responses to Side Proposition's case and introduce our two first substantive arguments, I'd just like to clarify a couple of things in this round. First of all, what exactly does call-out culture look like, and what sorts of things does it call out? It is outrage or public shaming of people and groups who say and do offensive things, often against minorities. This is not just minor instances of cultural appropriation. It looks like people like Roseanne comparing an African-American woman to an ape. It looks like the alt-right or neo-Nazis spouting hateful, racist, vitriolic rhetoric, saying, for example, that white people are superior to black people. It is things like the No Es No movement, which shames people who engage in sexual assault or deny that rape is a problem for women. We think, a second clarification we'd like to make is that we don't think that illegal actions like making death threats or acts of physical violence are a part of this debate. Finally, we say that we think that some private discourse can absolutely be part of the response to this sort of thing, but a necessary element of it is publicly calling out and shaming these individuals for doing problematic things. That is our stance. With that, let's introduce some responses to the material that they brought us. They brought you two arguments. First, about decreasing support for social movements, and second, on how people feel attacked because of this. Let's talk about undermining support. First, we tell you that it is unclear what they basically assert that Katy Perry's supporters feel alienated when she's called out for engaging in cultural appropriation. We didn't receive a ton of analysis on this point. We think that actually it is more likely to call attention to this problem when we do so publicly than when someone just confronts Katy Perry one-on-one about the fact that she shouldn't have done this. If you just do that, then you would draw absolutely no attention to the problems of cultural appropriation. But second, we think that supporters of Katy Perry are able to draw distinctions between things like minor instances of cultural appropriation and things like the neo-Nazi movement. So when neo-Nazis are directly called out for being really problematic, it's not like people are going to be less likely to support that just because they're angry about Katy Perry. We think people are rational enough to be able to make these kinds of distinctions. But finally, use something that they said against them. They told you that call-out culture does things like draw out many numbers of people to things like rallies in support of these causes. We think that that is a little bit contradictory at the point where they say that this is going to be massively alienating because a whole lot of people are turning out for this movement, and all of those massive numbers of people are apparently extreme. This seems like a contradiction. We think actually we draw way more attention to these issues on our side of the house. But their second argument was about how people feel attacked. Three things. First, we actually think that people will end up changing their ways. Katy Perry, for example, we think actually did apologize for this instance of cultural appropriation. This happens a lot. Second, to the extent that individuals are unwilling to change their ways when it's pointed out that what they did was terribly offensive, they were unlikely to change their ways on either side of the house. But third, we really don't think that the feelings of a neo-Nazi being hurt when they're called out for being super racist are more important than the feelings of African Americans or Jewish individuals who are constantly victimized by their rhetoric. We just think that that is more important. With that, let's introduce our first argument about how this is a necessary part of the principally just response to offensive rhetoric. Two ideas under this. The first is that it is in fact a proportional response. When someone says something super offensive, we have two issues with it. First, the content itself is just unacceptable and illegitimate. But second, it does actual public harm. It makes people that this rhetoric is directed to feel absolutely awful and often incites violence, with the example of, say, Donald Trump with Muslim women and their hijabs. We tell you that this speech is illegitimate, and failure to directly point that out in the public sphere means that that is not a just response. And engaging in sort of minor little instances of reasonable communication ignores the fact that this is a disproportionately unacceptable action that is being treated as acceptable. We think that is wrong. But second, on how this creates a principle of accountability. Often, absent call-out culture, the only way to hold individuals who engage in offensive rhetoric accountable, especially when minorities are involved, is to call them out. Existing power structures already make individuals complacent about getting justice for minorities. This is why in the U.S. continually fails to convict police officers who engage in instances of police brutality against African Americans, because there's a lot of complacency surrounding minority issues. Two reasons that call-out culture is important. First, often it is the only form of accountability. I'll take you in a moment. Take the example of Phord-Toy who was murdered by the police. The only form of accountability that officer got was being called out in public. But second, sometimes the only way to get accountability is for an individual to be called out. The reason that Roseanne Barr was fired from her TV show because she compared an African woman to an ape was because a lot of people reacted super negatively. That's the only way to get accountability. Go.
Do you support these people who are calling out others using extremely, racial slurs and, defamation to call them out?
We actually think that people using super offensive racial slurs are the ones who are being called out in the first place. Note that literally the info slide in the motion says that this is offensive rhetoric explicitly directed at minorities. So we really think that's a false characterization of what this world looks like. Our second argument in today's round is that we actually do, in fact, combat offensive action. This directly engages with their second substantive argument. First, in holding the individual who did the action accountable. Being shamed and called really offensive is a pretty jarring experience. We recognize that. It is hard, when you're confronted with this kind of thing, to question whether or not your belief is legitimate. If I say something like, I believe that white people are superior to Asian people, and people call me out for that and tell me that I'm racist, that necessarily makes me consider, is there some merit to what it is that they're saying? This self-reflection actually leads to these individuals sometimes changing their mind. Note that Roseanne Barr apologized for her rhetoric. Note that Katy Perry apologized for her instance of cultural appropriation. And when society is watching that individual apologize, they are also more likely to recognize that there were problems with that sort of behavior. But our second idea under this argument is that it also just creates discussions within society at large, even if that one individual doesn't change their mind. Things like massive social movements pointing out the problems with alt-right movements or neo-Nazi movements draws attention to the fact that that speech is in fact horribly illegitimate and really problematic. Just sitting by and talking to Nazis one-on-one about why maybe their ideas are problematic does not do nearly enough. Those individuals need to be called out in the public sphere so that we recognize that there is a massive problem and do something about it. So that we vote the politicians out of office who are supporting those neo-Nazi movements, or at least not directly calling them out. Directly talking one-on-one to people who engage in horribly offensive rhetoric ignores the reality that their actions have a public impact. We need to call them out publicly. Very proud to oppose.
The time is 8 minutes and 10 seconds. I would like to thank the first speaker of opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the second speaker of opposition to deliver their speech.
I think it was extremely telling when their first speech, the way that they tried to characterize call-out culture was an extreme discussion of the values of racism or the values of neo-Nazis and trying to create systemic change. The reason, judges, that they chose to focus on this is because they understood that the ground that they couldn't win on was what is actually true about call-out culture. The fact that call-out culture is about calling out individuals, not about discussing the movement. I can still discuss the harmful association of racial slurs. I can still watch the media can still report on individuals without it being call-outs. All of those are still mechanisms. Understand that this negates the majority of their argumentation in their first speech, talking about how the only way is to get public discourse about these individuals. Why is it not enough to see this discourse in the media? Why does it critically have to be calling out specific traits of specific individuals? And why is there characterization that this discussion is always productive? Because it seems ridiculous for them to assume that on their side of the house. When we gave you characterizations where this discussion has been actively harmful, notice I will continue to give you examples from places other than the USA. Okay, so what am I going to do for you? First of all, I'm going to explain why the arguments that my partner brought up were largely untouched and what the implication of that is in the round. And then secondly, I'm going to go into refute their two first main contentions. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the court of public opinion. How first of all, this is principally unjust due to the principles of disproportionality and consistency. And then secondly, how this harms the evolution of the movement. So first of all, let's talk about my partner's content. So the first idea that she brought you was the idea that the nature of this call-out culture ensures that you will not have a positive discussion and discourse of these movements overall. What they told you in response to this was largely that there are two categories of people. That there are people who are willing to change their ways, that are open to discourse, and that there are people that are so extreme that neither side of the house is going to sway them. We agree that there are some people that are so extreme that neither side of the house will sway them, but we think that there is a more nuanced description of the people that will potentially change their ways. We think that there are some individuals, like we characterized in our first point, that was not engaged with, that will be defensive, aggressive, and actively retaliatory when these people call them out publicly and shame them for specific traits. Note that this public shaming is not always, look, this person has done this racist thing. It is calling them specific names, specific language, targeting them as a person, not on their ideology. This means that they are less likely to be willing to come across in their side of the house. We told you the long-term impacts of this, which fundamentally clashes with their second argument that they did not address, which is that this removes legitimacy of the movement. Notice that this wasn't just about individuals not buying into the people that they support anymore. Notice that it is also about the framing, I'll take one of you guys in a second, the framing of this movement and how it fundamentally means that less people are likely to buy in because it is viewed as aggressive and lying and attacking people rather than being productive, which is what we want on our side of the house. Yeah.
Which is more effective, simply saying that Donald Trump did or said X thing, or framing it around the idea that it actively hurts the community, women,
Okay,
and
I think it is
minorities?
fine for the media to say Donald Trump has done this thing, the people in the community feel this way about it. That is not a call-out. What is a call-out is when individuals are targeting him personally and calling him orange-faced and stuff like that at the same time that they're calling out his policies. What this does is people don't view the legitimacy of the call-out. They only are laughing at the fact that people called him orange-faced. They don't view what is actually the discussion in the post, therefore you cannot get true discourse. But what did they tell you? So notice that the first point that they brought out is largely mitigated by the fact that there are media organizations. Why are these individuals better at upholding the standards that we want to uphold? They have higher standards. They might uphold to what is actually the truth, and they have media integrity, which ensures that they are more likely to try and engage with what is actually happening rather than what is subjectively happening. We think that overall they need to engage with the difference between social discussion and call-outs if they want to be able to win this debate. The second thing that they told you is why these people are likely to change. They told you, one, it is a jarring experience. Notice that this will only work for a very small subset of people. When I call you out personally for being a disgusting human being, are you likely to say, yes, I'm a disgusting human being? Or are you likely to band around with all the other people who support you and say, no, our ideals are correct, you are wrong and bigoted? That is what we are engaging with on our side of the house. All right, let's get into my argumentation, noticing that this is some of the most important material in the round, and if they fail to engage with it, they cannot win the debate today. So what do we believe the principle of the societal justice is? They talked to you a lot about this principle. They told you that if something is unacceptable, we must call it out in a public sphere so that there is no further possibility to do public harm. First of all, I've talked to you about how the media does this, but why is this not actually a good principle in what we as society believe is reasonable in the court of law and the court of public opinion? First of all, we think that the society picks democratically what views that it upholds. Recognize on their side of the house, there are racist individuals who will also be calling out individuals who are victims on our side of the house. They are the side that has backlash against victims. They cannot simply claim that it will always be proportionate on these people who are committing these crimes. We think that the law and the purpose of our society is to ensure that we are protecting individual rights. That is why we have a high bar before we induce massive harm on individuals by putting them in jail or publicly shaming them, because we believe that everybody has the right to be innocent until proven guilty. What is the impact of this? We think that, first of all, in call-out culture, there are a few unique things that do not happen. One, there is a lower bar for the amount of information that needs to come hold, both from the media and the judicial system. Because I can just have a feeling that somebody is not doing is okay, and I can call them out for it. It isn't always posting videos. It isn't always directly quoting individuals. It can be doing personal attacks against people, which is completely unproductive. Second of all, it often is untrue facts as well. For example, when individuals get called out, if we're looking at the movement, there are people in the United States that have been calling out leftist rallies as well for promoting improper values like LGBTQ rights and rallies. It goes both ways, ladies and gentlemen. Now, why is this problematic? We think that fundamentally they miss the word culture in this motion. Because this is a culture, meaning that this behavior gets relatively normalized. Actually, I'll take you in a second. We think that this means that you get a gut instinct that it is right to call people out, even if you don't know the facts. That is what is incredibly harmful. Yeah?
When people do in fact say that LGBTQ values are illegitimate, what do you think the response is? To say in the media in an objective sense, oh, this happened, or to say, this happened, this is wrong, disgusting, and vitriolic.
So I think the media is a lot better at portraying the different sides of an issue than an individual calling it out, because you may have personal stakes in the issue. You may be more likely to play in societal narratives. I think that's fine. What are the impacts of my argument that you have to pay attention? First, it is disproportionate. If I get called out in the media, either if it is correct or if it is incorrect, it means I cannot get a job. It means that there is public shaming, my quality of life is drastically reduced in an insanely disproportionate way to what is actually correct as society. This is especially problematic if the behavior is untrue. We think that this means that individuals can weaponize this behavior in unfortunate ways. For example, T.M. Krishna called out Bollywood music producers for discrimination based on caste in India. Then those media producers flooded his Facebook page with hate regimens, and less people actually attended his concerts. This is the sort of negative stuff we see on both sides. Notice, it is not enough for them to say that sometimes things will get better under their side of the house. They have to prove wholeheartedly that this is a movement worth supporting on net. They have not done so. Proud to propose.
8 minutes and 13 seconds. I would like to thank the second speaker of proposition for this speech, and would like to invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
If the worst impact that happens on the opposition side of the House is that quote-unquote social justice warriors cause Katy Perry's album sales to drop, or Donald Trump is called orange face, quite frankly, we can live with that if it means that individuals who do problematic and racist things are held accountable, especially in a world where they would not otherwise be able to do so in existing government mechanisms and existing systems of power. For far too long, individuals have been able to perpetuate injustice against women, against minorities, and against individuals of differing sexualities without any recourse. We think the way to have that recourse is through call-out culture. Very proud to oppose. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to be engaging with everything we've heard so far, coming out of the proposition bench, and then moving into our third substantive argument that call-out culture enhances conversations toward social progress. But now, Let's get into what we heard coming in the first and second proposition speeches. First, let's deal with what they told us at the very top of the first proposition speech. Their characterization of the alternative of call-out culture is what they call, quote-unquote, call-in culture. But recognize that emailing, calling, and talking to someone who is racist can coexist with call-out culture. But why do we tell you that call-out culture is so necessary to have any of the impacts that both sides agree are important happen? 2 reasons. We think that first off, call-out culture creates a large quantity of awareness about why an individual is doing something discriminatory and that thing happened in the first place. But the second thing that we tell you is it creates a consequence of shame. Both of these mechanisms are a prerequisite to tangible change to motivate curtailing discriminatory beliefs. I'll get into explaining those more underneath the fundamental question of the debate. The main question at the heart of the debate is, does call-out culture effectively combat discrimination? We think the answer is very clearly yes. The heart of their argument relies on a series of assumptions. They assume that call-out culture and education cannot coexist. They assume that after an individual is called out, there is no discussion on the larger issue or why that person held that belief. And they assume that all individuals, celebrities and politicians included, can be best impacted by simply receiving an email that says, I think you might be discriminatory. We reject all of these assumptions. But furthermore, we think it's really quite simple. Call-out culture brings attention to larger societal issues. Look to the example of the comparable analysis we give you in our second substantive argument with the hashtag #MeToo movement. We think that, for example, calling out Harvey Weinstein for sexual assault created the hashtag #HowIWillChange movement. Note, the discussion did not stop at Harvey Weinstein should not be sexually assaulting women. Rather, it led to a very large outcry of women saying for far too long, sexual assault has gone unaccountable and it has actually led to 0 consequences. As a result, call-out culture uniquely incentivizes a larger quantity of people to engage in these social movements. We don't think it's as simple as them, quote-unquote, being calling social justice warriors, and even if that were the case, they don't tell us why that demotivates movements. But furthermore, what we would say is it creates an incentive for society to decide to address the problem, for example, of people in power abusing that power. But the second response we have here is that call-out culture creates a unique incentive for individuals to change. The proposition tells us to pursue positive discussions, but we think when the proposition says individuals will always be defensive, this is untrue. Individuals have an incentive to change if they think failure to do so will lead to things like shame. For example, if I'm an individual who has been said that I have a cultural appropriation, I have an active incentive to learn what I am doing and why that offends certain people to avoid that level of shame in the future. We are the only side that's giving you this sophisticated incentive analysis as to why in the majority of cases the incentive exists to become more educated. But now let's attack the next idea that we heard about this third substantive argument about having more justice through the court system. So we have 3 responses. First off, the media is a mechanism to call people out. At that point, we think they've crossed the bench in today's debate. Whenever they tell us that simply, well, we'd rather have the media do it, they're conceding the fact that calling people out is effective. Their stance is extremely muddled. Secondly, we think, as the information slide suggests, the focus of the debate is not simply individuals being racist, but rather, the focus of the debate ought to be on individuals who are being discriminatory against minorities or women, not simply the other way around. We don't think that's at the heart of the debate. But third, they tell us that individuals ought to be innocent until proven guilty through courts. 2 problems. We think these additionally ally with the argument that we gave you on accountability that we did not hear sufficient response to. First, we can support laws against things like hate speech, but second, call-out culture creates accountability where accountability did not exist prior to that. For example, we think a lot of court systems have discriminatory biases that would favor individuals who might be doing things, for example, like being racist or sexist because there are less minorities and less women in these systems in general. We think at that point, the only way to access the accountability we both agree is so important is not by simply giving power to institutions that are in and of themselves discriminatory. Rather, we advocate for calling out those individuals, not simply equating them and giving them more legitimacy and power. Before I go on to our third point, I'll take a point.
So call-out culture has only existed in the last 2 to 3 years with the rise of social media. Do you believe minorities got any extra rights in the time before that?
We think that, yes, other things happen, but we think call-out culture uniquely makes it easier for these issues to be discussed. For example, with the hashtag MeToo movement, for example, with the hashtag Ils sont un non movement or No es no movement. We think by having call-out culture, it uniquely makes accountability more likely in a world where now more people can actually coalesce around making that accountability happen, meaning that we both agree that change is important. It happens more on our side of the house. Now, into our third substantive argument, that call-out culture enhances conversations towards social progress. Our first point under this argument is that call-out culture combats false equivalencies. What does the alternative of call-out culture look like? We can analyze this from the perspectives of the past few decades, as they've just told us. We think the alternative proposition defends as one where civil discourse is the best case scenario for addressing biases. The problem is, whenever civility lends legitimacy to entirely illegitimate perspectives, call-out culture uniquely evokes a level of shame over respect. The alternative is whenever individuals who are racist, homophobic, or transphobic we think are respected in public discourse. For example, a KKK member engaging in either a debate or an interview where a commentator qualifies an argument with their own language of, I understand where you're coming from. We don't think it's okay to understand where that individual is coming from in any circumstance. These examples mean that individuals who share any level of beliefs now view their own actual beliefs as being less problematic, because if they were really that bad, people would be outraged. Call-out culture is the only mechanism for avoiding the spread of false narratives by ending false equivalencies at their root. But the second point we have underneath this argument is that call-out culture incentivizes change. Oftentimes, people in positions of power rely on public favorability. For example, politicians, people in the media, or celebrities all require public consent to achieve power. Thus, call-out culture challenges that favorability if it means people in positions of power have the greatest incentive to adapt accordingly. In a world without call-out culture, why are these individuals unlikely to change? On proposition's highest ground, perhaps they don't realize their beliefs are problematic, but secondly, we would say they often have an incentive not to change. For example, NBC had an incentive to keep on Roseanne Barr until they realized it would actually damage their viewing, and they had a large public outcry, meaning that they were going to fire her for making a lot of racist tweets. For example, Marco Rubio had the incentive to accept donations from the NRA until he was called out for it on national TV. On our side of the house, we challenge the preconditions for power occurring, and the only way to legitimize that is through the people. By handing the people the power to make these decisions, to call people out for being discriminatory, we think it's a clear ballot for the opposition.
8 minutes and 14 seconds. I would like to thank the second speaker of opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of proposition to deliver their speech.
Ready? At the top of the speech, I want to make a confession. This is not exactly my most confident round, because social justice has never been a strong suit of mine. And I'm especially intimidated from participating in this discussion, in this debate, because I'm afraid of these three women on the other side of the floor calling me out for saying something that is insensitive, something that isn't very accurate, something that I have made an error with that is going to be exposed, and I'm going to be ashamed of people that care about me, people who are literally judging me. What side opposition is doing is hindering discussion that is actually progressive towards societal change. And we think that that is the best mechanism to which these people can get better protection on our side of the house. Two clarifications at the top of the speech. Firstly, their rhetoric about how there is no alternative for these people to get recourse and the existing power structures have systematically failed. Firstly, I think it's just worth it to point out that that was a complete assertion on their side, the fact that existing power structures have systematically failed. But secondly, we've given you a number of alternatives that are mutually exclusive to the call-out culture that is happening in status quo. The fact that call-in culture is a preferable counterfactual on our side. The fact that media reporting can still happen on our side. It is ridiculous for side opposition to say that media can no longer, we can't support for media like calling out Kim Jong-un for like reporting on the fact that Kim Jong-un is not being a very good leader of North Korea. That would be just not reporting on any bad deeds at all. We would support a world in which Harvey Weinstein and all these other people were reported by the media in saying that these people committed sexual assaults and these people have done these things, not people on social media, not people who are publicly shaming and showing outrage in unofficial platforms. But second clarification. I think they need to do a better job of clarifying that they support call-out culture in particular. Why? Because opposition's framing of this debate so far has been, police brutality is a huge issue. Sexual assault is a huge issue. That's the only issue that they want to defend and that are getting called out in status quo. No thank you. When this becomes a culture, and when this culture is on the rise, there are necessarily people who stand up on the bandwagon and trivialize issues, bring up issues that are not as important, and taint the movement as a whole. That is why we think that it is very, harmful that this has become a culture that is so widespread. Because every call-out that is trivial, every call-out that is not as important, means that the value of each call-out is diluted. The value of each call-out is given to the audience with the speck of doubt that says, is this really legitimate? That's the only mechanism, that's the only side opposition's world is a world in which these valuable call-outs get crowded out and delegitimized at the point in which the culture is so toxic and on the rise. Two questions to summarize this debate. First, how do we help victims of these offensive actions? Second, how do we get better societal change? First question then, how do we help victims of these offensive actions? I want to clarify that there are two types of offensive actions that we're largely talking about in this debate. The first are the errors, the misinformed actions, the unintentional microaggression that I, as an uninformed person of social justice issue, may bring up and accidentally in a speech like this. Their response on their side would be to viscerally, publicly shame those people. No thank you. There are a number of problems with this. The first is that it intimidates them from ever supporting that movement in the future, because they perceive that movement as that is something that is violent, something that is aggressive, something that is very toxic to them. But second, fans of a celebrity that was publicly shamed on the media would likely to go on the backlash and say, I support this fan. An example of this is Sunny Sensei, a YouTuber who went and called out Bruno Mars for being culturally inappropriate, and the fans of Bruno Mars going after the YouTube channel and going after them and saying, posting hateful comments on that YouTube channel. We think that these are far more likely to happen, and social justice issues become much more rigid at the point in which it is attached to you as an identity, to you as a fan of Katy Perry or Bruno Mars. But thirdly, we think it's much more likely that these people on the middle, who are moderate and don't have a clear stance, become more defensive at the point in which they are hurt. They are ashamed of people in front of people who care about them, and agree with actually the other side because they've seen the harmful side of social justice. What did they tell you on their side? They said, well, these people who are in the middle will be intimidated from continuing to do these actions, and that is a benefit on their side because they become aware that there will be no backlash. Even if there is a subset of people who will not continue to do these actions in their side of the world, why is that benefit far outweighed by the harms that we showed you under this actor? Two reasons. Firstly, notice that although they are held accountable and will not likely to do these actions in the future, these people never understand the problem. Because the only way that they've been exposed to the problem is the fact that a person has viscerally called them out in public media. So they literally don't know what the issue is behind it because they've been attacked and they don't understand the problem. I'll take you in a second. But secondly, the trade-off is this. People who are not going to, possibly not going to make these microaggression actions in the future versus the vast majority of people who are never going to join this movement and will stay indifferent in the middle because they think that that movement is violent and aggressive. Go ahead.
When Harvey Weinstein was called out by the Me Too movement and social media, the issue was as simple as this. Sexual assault was continuing without accountability. We are the only side that enables that accountability to happen in the first place.
We support the media objectively saying this person has done this. The harm is a rise of a culture that is toxifying this rhetoric and saying this person is the epitome of sexual assault and this person should be targeted, ignoring the larger issue, but also attacking that person to an unreasonable extent that alienates allies of that movement. Notice that the allies, the people in the middle, are the person that you should weigh the most in this round, because you need the support of those people to get actual change. Second then, the second type of attack I want to talk about are the intentional ones, the targeted ones, the ones that are very harmful to these people. Their side's mechanism to solve these problems is the public shame of them, to hold these people accountable, to raise discussion and awareness of this issue. We told you that for those actors who are very conservative, very racist or sexist, these positive benefits will likely never accrue. No thank you. At the point in which you legitimize the movement as violent and aggressive, so those racist and sexist people can use that as ammunition to go back at that group. At the point in which they're more likely to strike back by adding a comment, by calling them back out and saying that these people are not representing, not being socially acceptable in the public sphere. But thirdly, you alienate the people in the middle at the point in which the toxic rhetoric back and forth becomes so radicalized that they don't want to join in the fight. We think that even if fewer sexist and racist exist marginally on their side, we think that the awareness that you get is empowering for the racist and sexist people the most. Because the nature of social media is that the discussion is shallow. The discussion is taken with a grain of doubt. That means that the empowerment that you get to the sexist and racist people are far more harmful than the support you get on their side. Second, quickly then, how do we get societal change? We think that they talked about how public impact deserves a public response. We've told you very clearly from our second speaker that didn't get a proper response, that the public isn't held accountable at the point in which they can get back with even more racial slurs, with even more toxic rhetoric that is not proportionally justified under a legal lens, right? We think that we legitimize the act of calling out someone very harmfully and in a toxic manner at the point in which you legitimize this back and forth by saying calling out culture is a good thing. The calling out culture that has happened and is on the rise right now has diluted the purpose of social justice movements that exist today and has taken that movement backwards. It is not effective at protecting the victims of these microaggressions and other attacks, and we're very proud to propose.
8 minutes and 13 seconds. I would like to thank the third speaker of opposition for their speech and would like to invite the third speaker of opposition to deliver their
In my country, call-out culture is the mechanism that removed a woman who amounted African Americans to apes from the public sphere. In my country, call-out culture is what keeps my country's president at the lowest approval ratings in all of history from any president that we've had before. In my country, call-out culture is what holds these individuals who do such atrocious and offensive things directly towards minorities to be held accountable in the long term. We think on side opposition that is never something that you ought to regret, but rather something that you should encourage and to continue to have on our side of the house, that we stand so proud on side opposition. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. The first is going through one major strategic flaw made by side proposition that cost them today's debate, before moving on to discussing one key question that should summarize today's debate and help you evaluate why we have won. Which side produces the best quality of discourse and societal change? But on to the strategic flaw that we heard from side proposition. We think that it was incredibly strategically problematic for them when side proposition down the bench presented to you a very simple and narrow aspect up to which we should be having today's debate. This debate was not that, well, cultural appropriation is better handled one-on-one, or that victims may be called out and minorities may be called out in call-out culture, even though the info slide uniquely tells you that the people who often call out these individuals are minorities themselves who are being oppressed by individuals who already hold power in society, or that, well, we have to justify slander or libel or death threats accused to different people who may have done something offensive. We think that this round was ultimately lost when they chose to do this for two key reasons. One, because they chose to engage with a very easy way out of today's debate, when they chose to simply brush off answers about police brutality, about alt-right movements, about neo-Nazis, which are very, very real consequences that are happening in multiple different countries, something that is very unique and the massive amount of which call-out culture surrounds, but secondly, it disregards massive amounts of movements in the long term by simply narrowing it down to Katy Perry and Justin Timberlake. Note, those are not the people who uniquely harm minorities in the long term. That's why we are going to win today's debate. Now let's really go into the questions of what really summarizes today's debate, on which side produces the best quality of discourse and societal change. Ultimately, two mechanisms were produced in today's debate. The first mechanism was the mechanism that we heard from side proposition. We were told that ultimately, the argument that they have is that you need to have a one-on-one private encounter with the person who may be oppressing you or minorities. It needs to be a call-in culture, which is inclusive to the people who are perpetuating such very problematic things in the status quo. Here's the thing. We think that that's ineffective insofar that the people who are involved in call-out culture no longer recognize the magnitude of their harms. What's something that you uniquely get with call-out culture? Magnitude. You get quantity of people standing up and saying, you know what you did was wrong. This is something that they say is a bad thing. Note, when we think that massive amounts of African Americans start calling out Donald Trump for discriminatory policies, that signals to Donald Trump that this is a big issue. If each one of those people just DM'd him and was like, hey Donald Trump, can you please stop passing discriminatory policies? We don't think the change would be unique because he doesn't experience the shame, he doesn't recognize the guilt of what he is doing. That's the unique thing that call-out culture does. But second, we think that certain one-on-one discussions are not a proportional response. Why is this the case? Ella and Emily gave you a lot of great analysis on this, but let's dig even deeper. We think that if we looked at this visually, this looks like U.S. reporters sitting down with KKK members and saying, well, you know what, I see where you're coming from, but what about this? Here's the thing. We should never see where a KKK person is ever coming from. We should never want to sympathize with a neo-Nazi because their side, their response, disproportionately harms massive amounts of people. We think it's perfectly fine for people to be outraged by this, to feel completely offended when these individuals say, you know what, you're not human, or you don't deserve rights, or they're simply taking over another person's culture. This means that ultimately we are holding these individuals accountable, we're calling them out for the offensive things that they've done, and giving the minority people who are shut out in society finally have a voice. But lastly, we think that there's no reason, and have given you absolutely no reason, as to why we have to prioritize the feelings of these individuals over the feelings of the minority people who are often the ones who are more greatly hurt by these problematic things that are said. They gave you no reason as to why we need to say, okay, Harvey Weinstein, your feelings got hurt because you sexually assaulted a bunch of people and got called out. No, our side of the house would tell you the people who ought to be prioritized is the 40 women who he sexually assaulted. Those are the people who deserve justice. Those are the people who deserve to have a voice. But lastly, even if you don't buy anything that I just told you right now, we tell you uniquely that there's no reason why having civil discourse can't be paired with call-out culture as well. Here's the thing. We tell you that when you have individuals who ultimately call someone out for doing something offensive, that individual feels shame, feels regret, feels remorse, sits down and says, okay, what do I do to change? That's where you get civil discourse. If you don't have this call-out culture, they usually don't recognize anything is wrong, or they don't recognize the magnitude of what they are doing is wrong. Now, furthermore, I'll take a point.
Do you believe Donald Trump has acknowledged what he has done wrong?
Yes, I think that there's been instances where he's actually come out and apologized for some things that he has done. But furthermore, we think that in the long term, even if Donald Trump doesn't come out and apologize, it shows that there's still hope for other things to be able to change. Where did we see this happen in other instances in local elections, right? Even if Donald Trump is a lost cause, we don't think necessarily everyone is on the side of, in this world. Let's look to the March for Our Lives movement, right? Uniquely, dozens of high school students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who were victims of mass shootings, called out massive amounts of gun regulation within the United States, called out their senators uniquely, shamed them for not doing something that is beneficial towards them, not creating policies, and shamed them for accepting NRA donations. This resulted in them ultimately opening up and having a public forum with these people in the first place. We think that when you have call-out culture in conjunction with civil discourse, that's where you amount in change. Now for the March for Our Lives movement has seen in over 13 states a massive amount of rise in gun regulation policies. We can get change on our side of the house. We think that that's much more beneficial.
What mechanism did side opposition give you, and why is this preferable, though? We told you that in call-out culture, through expressing outrage and publicly shaming people or groups who have done something that is offensive or derogatory towards individuals, often against minorities, which was specified within the info slide that we were given, we tell you no, this does not alienate people, it includes them in society. Because the reason why is now we begin to humanize the narrative. When multiple individuals in the Me Too movement stood up and called out their perpetrator of sexual assault, that's where we actually saw more humanization of how harmful it is against women. But secondly, we think it's a unique way of upholding accountability, especially in a world where no one is actually giving accountability to minorities in the first place. If you look to instances where call-out culture actually is creating significant change, look to the Black Lives Matter movement. No part of the U.S. court system actually cares about black people in the long term. But what does care about black people is when you upload a video of police brutality happening against a loved one. That's how you humanize something. That's how you get more people within the broader public to be able to stand up and stand with you. But secondly, we think that this isn't just something that's unique to the United States. If you look to the hashtag Ils en Nombre movement, we've told you that the French movement ultimately helped be able to show the government that they need to accept more refugees. They showed them that this is something that's important in the long term. We've told you that we're the side that creates tangible change because we're the ones that call out individuals for doing offensive things, insofar that they themselves conceded that this is a good thing by saying that simply the media can do it. We think we're doing the same thing. We're just handing the voice back to the people who are actually being offended, the minorities. Thank you.
8 minutes and 21 seconds. I would like to thank the third speaker of opposition for this speech and would like to invite the reply speaker of the opposition to
Let's engage in some comparative work and analyze what each side stands for. Here is side proposition's advocacy. I should privately email neo-Nazis and police officers that murder African Americans saying, hey, maybe your beliefs and actions are somewhat problematic. We should report in the news that Donald Trump just called Mexicans rapists and murderers. Oh, and here's the weather. Here is what we stand for on our side of the house. Calling neo-Nazis and brutal police officers out and making people like Andrew scared of being associated with such movements such that they don't engage in those kinds of behaviors. Saying that Donald Trump is a racist Cheeto and you shouldn't vote for him. That is what we stand for on our side of the house. That is what achieves actual tangible change. That is the principally proportional response to the disgusting rhetoric that comes out of some people's mouths. That is why we're so proud to oppose and take today's debate. 2 questions in the speech. First, why is calling out a principally necessary response to offensive rhetoric? And second, which side actually does create social change? First, on this being principally necessary, we didn't get very much engagement with our principal about how this is in fact the proportional response to incredibly offensive rhetoric. Treating these, talking about things like horrific racism and offensive comments, which is what this debate is about, objectively, or just talking about things one-on-one, ignores first, the massive public impact that this kind of rhetoric has, but second, the fact that it is in fact really, really problematic. And as Emily tells you in her speech, in our third argument, talking about this sort of speech objectively legitimizes it. When you debate a neo-Nazi on reasonable ground, you tacitly acknowledge and signal to society that those sorts of beliefs are reasonable for people to have. We think this is intensely problematic, both principally and practically. But we also heard very little engagement on the point that there is absolutely often no accountability for individuals in a world without calling out individuals who engage in offensive rhetoric, particularly against minorities. We told you that there are power structures and incentives for individuals in power not to do things like persecute white police officers who engage in police brutality. There are things that, there are structural incentives for the court system not to say persecute people who rip hijabs off of Muslim women, which is a hate crime. The only way that we get justice for these individuals on our side of the house, which we think is tremendously important, is through call-out culture. But what was the principle that they brought us? Their principle was basically Harvey Weinstein's feelings, that just because Harvey Weinstein committed acts of sexual assault, he shouldn't be demonized as responsible for the entire movement of sexual assault whatsoever. I'm sorry, he raped dozens of women. Harvey Weinstein deserves it. And the only proportional response to the horrible things that he did is to directly call him out, to make him feel bad about it, and to make other people realize that this is absolutely horrible, that this should not be done, not that it's just something objective that we should recognize exists on their side of the house. But second, which side, in fact, does create social change? So basically, their biggest argument in today's round is that people come to think that these movements are extreme, and this delegitimizes movements. First of all, we just reject the characterization that a super extreme response to extreme racism is to point out that that racism is disgusting. But second, the people who are likely to see this as an extreme response and be alienated by this movement are the people who are unlikely to change on either side of the house. But second, even if we do acknowledge that maybe this alienates some individuals, not publicly calling out and shaming these individuals means that the public is drawn way less attention to these kinds of movements. Either that they're occurring in the first place because we're focusing just on individual one-on-one private interactions, or that these things are a really big problem. And this is true of people who are either being called out themselves. We told you about Marco Rubio being brought to the table to talk about issues when he was publicly shamed, and for society at large, when we talk not just about the fact that problematic things are occurring, but that they are in fact problematic. We think that calling individuals out is the only way to draw this kind of attention, even if there are marginal people alienated on each side of the house. That's the way that we protect minorities. That's the way we achieve change. Call them out.
4 minutes and 22 seconds. I would like to thank the reply speaker of the opposition for this speech, and would like to invite the reply speaker of the proposition to deliver this.
It becomes harder and harder to call out people like Trump for using ad hominem attacks when you go and call him a racist Cheeto. Because you're doing the exact same thing to him as he's doing to others, which justifies what he is doing. Every single time you do that, you alienate portions of his society. Every time you do that, you make real change unlikely to occur. That is the comparative that we have to deal with in this debate. It's not whether or not it is justified to call out individuals who are for sure racist. It is about, one, whether those people are actually racist and whether or not those people should be actually called out, and two, will this get the change they want? Before I go into my two themes, first of all about justice and secondly about change, let's make some important clarifications. In this debate, when in their first speech they get up and say, we don't have to defend people who do hate crimes, who say things that are violent, they cannot come up and then argue the majority of their case on neo-Nazis and alt-right people who are advocating hate and violence against other people. So let's engage with what both sides agreed was the vast majority of people in this debate. Andrew actually gave you three good definitions of the kind of people we're talking about in this debate, which they described as narrow when they only engaged with one of them. What were those three people? We talked about one, the person that is likely to stop. Two, the person in the middle ground who isn't insanely radicalized or racist, but the person who is unlikely to change if being forced into the public spotlight. And three, the radical person. Notice in all of my themes that I'll be discussing how these individuals get addressed instead of just changing with the actor that they wanted to talk about in this debate. So first of all, let's talk about justice. Acknowledge that this theme is only a means to an end. So this theme is about applying the principle of justice and then using that to dictate which side gets best change. It is not enough to win on this debate alone. So what did they tell you on their side of the house? They told you that it is proportionate and necessary because it causes public harm. So first of all, even if it is proportionate and even if it is necessary, they must prove that it causes some net good to society in order to win this debate. It is not enough to argue this on principle when we are trying to argue net good for the most harmed people. Why is our principle more legitimate then? Because we talked to you about how individuals view society, how individuals perceive disproportionality and perceive people who are victims or just untrue claims as being applied to these issues. We told you how this is going to cause more backlash against the movement. We told you why society will not buy in and how that is crucial to change. They tried to disregard this entire point by framing our principle as Harvey Weinstein's feelings. That is not what we gave you as a principle. Do not let them misframe and call out our principle in an unjust way. We told you that it is importantly to acknowledge that justice must mean that victims are also able to achieve justice. How these individuals may also be called out, they may also be threatened. So regrets is about the net harm or net good and whether what it has done on their side of the house. So let's talk about change as our second issue. We told you that the biggest aspect of change is to push forward things in the media, to focus on call-ins so that individuals don't get distrustful. They tried to steal all this ground and notice that when they said we can get discussion, we can have call-ins, we can have media, and we can have this sort of call-outs. Notice this doesn't engage with the analysis we gave you right up in first, which is that whenever you get this sort of call-out culture, it delegitimizes these sorts of values and means you are less likely to have productive discussion. It means that you are more likely to call out other people in return. It means that you can't tell what is the legitimate discussion because people are just calling each other names back and forth and you never get productiveness. You remove that legitimacy. Fundamentally in this debate, the side that you should vote for is the side that is giving you the most legitimate and fair characterization of what the populace needs and is what most likely to get changed. Notice that everything about social discourse, about calling out publicly mass numbers